I'm from Denver, and this story took place a few years ago on a cold, snowy Saturday evening. My friend Matt and I were heading to a dinner party. It had been snowing for most of the day, and though we weren't looking forward to driving in the bad weather, we still decided to stop at a liquor store before heading to the party. We didn't want to show up empty-handed. The snow was already coming down pretty hard, and the roads weren't great, but we figured a quick detour wouldn't hurt. Inside the liquor store, we picked out a couple of local craft beers and a bottle of whiskey for the party. The snow had picked up by the time we got back to the car, but Matt realized he forgot to buy Zins, his current nicotine fix. I wasn't thrilled about waiting in the car while he ran back into the store, especially since I was the one driving and my car wasn't exactly suited for the snow, but I let it slide. After a few minutes, he came back with his Zins, hopped into the car, and we set off. As we pulled out of the parking lot, I couldn't help but notice how much heavier the snow had gotten. It was falling in thick sheets, quickly covering the roads. We had about a 20 to 30-minute drive through mostly suburban neighborhoods, but with the worsening conditions, the trip started to feel more like a treacherous journey. Let me be honest, I'm not a great driver, especially in snow, and my car was slipping every few seconds, which didn't help my anxiety. I kept gripping the steering wheel tighter with every minute that passed. We were making slow progress when, after a tense few minutes of driving uphill, we rounded a corner and saw something unexpected. A car, completely stopped in the middle of the road. Its hazard lights were flashing in the snowstorm, cutting through the darkness like distress beacons. What made it even more unnerving was that both the driver's side and passenger's side doors were wide open, but no one seemed to be around. For a moment I thought about just driving around the car and continuing on our way. After all, we were already running late to the party, and stopping didn't seem like the best idea. But Matt, being the more empathetic of the two of us, urged me to stop the car. He sounded genuinely concerned, and I could tell he was thinking someone might be in trouble. Me? Not so much. Call me jaded, but I've had my fair share of experiences that have left me distrusting of strangers. I'd rather avoid the potential drama altogether. Still, Matt was persistent. He'd gotten us into sticky situations before because of his curiosity, but this time felt different. Someone might actually need help, and I could see it was weighing on him. Reluctantly, I pulled over and parked the car a few feet away from the stopped vehicle. For a few seconds, the two of us just sat there in silence, staring at the car through the snow-covered windshield. Matt asked if we should go check it out. I wasn't too keen on the idea, but I knew he wouldn't drop it. I suggested waiting just a little longer, maybe hoping someone would magically appear and we wouldn't have to do anything. Matt wasn't thrilled about sitting there doing nothing, but he agreed. We both kept our eyes on the car, watching the eerie, rhythmic blinking of the hazard lights against the backdrop of swirling snow. Nothing happened. No one showed up. The whole scene was starting to feel like something out of a horror movie, and my nerves were kicking into overdrive. After what felt like an eternity, Matt finally said he'd had enough waiting and decided to go investigate. Before I could protest, he was already stepping out of the car and trudging through the snow toward the stopped vehicle. I watched as he slowly approached the car, and that's when I noticed something strange out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, dark and barely visible in the periphery of my vision. It moved quickly, but I couldn't tell what it was. My heart skipped a beat. Was it just the snow playing tricks on me? Or was there something, or someone, lurking nearby? Seconds later, I thought I saw the car jolt ever so slightly, like something, or someone, had moved inside the trunk or back seat. At that moment, I knew I wasn't sticking around to find out. I slammed on the horn, startling Matt, who had been peering inside the vehicle. He jumped, looked back at me, and understood immediately what I was trying to communicate. Without hesitation, he sprinted back to the car, and I floored it as soon as he was inside. As we sped away, I explained to him that I had a gut feeling the whole thing was a trap. He wasn't thrilled about my lack of concrete evidence, but I told him I wasn't going to take any chances. I'd rather be paranoid than end up in a dangerous situation, especially in the middle of a snowstorm. Matt seemed a little annoyed, but deep down I knew he understood where I was coming from. Still, the tension in the car was palpable for the rest of the drive. We eventually made it to the dinner party, though things between Matt and I were still a bit awkward. The party itself was a welcome distraction. After a few drinks and catching up with friends, we started to relax and almost forgot about the unsettling encounter from earlier. Hours passed, and just as we were getting ready to leave, the host turned on the TV to check the local news for updates on the snowstorm. What we saw on the screen sent a chill down my spine. The police were issuing a report about a stolen vehicle in the area. According to the report, a woman and her teenage son had been driving home when they came across a car stopped in the middle of the road. Hazards on, doors wide open, just like the one we had seen. When they stopped to help, 2 men jumped out from behind a nearby snowbank, and another emerged from the trunk of the car. The men held the woman at gunpoint, forcing her to hand over her keys before speeding off in both her car and the one they had used as bait. I looked at Matt, my heart racing. That could have been us. We were seconds away from falling into the same trap. I could see the realization hit him too as we shared a silent, terrified glance. We immediately told the other guests what had happened to us earlier, and the mood at the party shifted. People were shocked, but they also couldn't stop asking us questions, eager to hear the full story. By the time we left the party, I couldn't shake the fear that had settled in the pit of my stomach. That night could have ended very differently. The incident left a lasting mark on me, deepening my already ingrained distrust of strangers. Whenever I drive by a stopped car now, I can't help but think back to that snowy night and the danger we narrowly avoided. It's scary to think how easily we could have been caught in a trap, and how many others might have fallen for it. This story might sound strange, but please bear with me. When I was in high school, there was a kid who made everyone uncomfortable by claiming he was a demon. I don't even feel at ease writing his actual name, for reasons you'll soon understand, so let's call him Patrick. His real name, however, had this odd, old-fashioned ring to it, almost like something from a Shakespeare play. Patrick was someone who immediately stood out, but not in a good way. He had this unnerving, vacant stare that he always carried with him. And it wasn't just students that noticed. Teachers were creeped out by it too. He had this aura that made everyone uneasy. Patrick was extremely socially awkward and seemed detached from reality. What really made him noticeable, though, was that he wore the same dull gray hoodie every single day. I'm not exaggerating, he literally never changed his clothes. It looked like the hoodie had never been washed either. The smell was something everyone talked about behind his back, and it just added to his off-putting presence. Physically, Patrick was on the shorter side, and pretty average-looking, but you wouldn't be able to tell since he always kept his hood up and wore sunglasses. Yes, even indoors. It became something of a running joke among students. But his stubbornness in refusing to take off his sunglasses just added to his unsettling demeanor. Eventually, even the teachers stopped bothering to ask him to remove them because he simply wouldn't listen. No matter what anyone said, Patrick did what he wanted. No one could make him change. Now here's where things get even weirder. Patrick didn't have friends in the traditional sense. He never seemed to have any real social connections, but he had this bizarre habit of adopting people. I don't mean legally, of course. What he would do is, if he liked you, he'd walk up to you randomly one day and say, "You're adopted," as if this meant you were part of his circle. According to him, being adopted by him meant that you were safe from him, and possibly from other threats only he knew about. No one really knew what being adopted by Patrick truly entailed, but it was clear that once he decided you were part of his circle, he would pay extra attention to you. He didn't adopt many people, only a select few, and for some reason, I was one of them. I'm still not entirely sure why he picked me, but looking back, it was probably because he had some kind of crush on me. At the time, though, none of us really took his demon act seriously. Everyone just assumed he was a troubled kid who had some serious issues. He definitely was troubled, but no one could have guessed the depths of how strange things would get. For context, this all happened in Wayne, Pennsylvania, the town where I grew up. A quiet, suburban place that seemed uneventful most of the time. Another girl in our circle, Gabby, had also been adopted by Patrick. Patrick's crush on her was more obvious than the one he had on me. It was something everyone in our group knew about, and we often joked about it behind his back. Though, of course, we never let him hear us. One day, my friends and I were hanging out at the dugouts behind our high school. It was a pretty standard afternoon for us, just killing time before heading home, talking about whatever random topics came up. That day, The conversation drifted toward Patrick's very obvious crush on Gabby. We were all laughing about it, and I remember Gabby looking particularly embarrassed. Back then, we had come up with a nickname for Patrick because saying his real name felt clunky and weird. But for some reason that afternoon, Laura, another friend of ours, used his real name. She said it once, twice, and then a third time, without even thinking about it. I swear to you, as soon as his name was said the third time, Patrick appeared out of nowhere. One moment, we were sitting there, joking around, and the next, Patrick was standing on top of the dugout, holding a baseball bat in his hand. It wasn't a horror movie scary moment, but it was so sudden and unsettling that I immediately froze. There was something about his presence that felt off. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, looking at us with that same empty stare he always had. We all stopped talking the instant we saw him. I think we were worried he might have overheard us talking about him, and none of us wanted to find out what would happen if he did. The atmosphere was tense, and I could feel my heart racing. I decided to give him a small wave, trying to act like nothing was wrong. He acknowledged me with a small nod, which was even creepier than if he'd ignored me. Without a word, he jumped down from the dugout and walked away, just as suddenly as he had appeared. As soon as we were sure he was gone, we all burst into nervous laughter. We tried to laugh it off like it was just some weird random coincidence, but deep down, I think all of us were a little disturbed by what had just happened. I know I was. A few weeks later, something even stranger happened. This time, it wasn't funny at all. I was hanging out at Laura's house. We were in her room, just chatting about whatever, and once again, Patrick's name came up. This time, it was just the two of us, and between the two of us, his name was mentioned 3 times. About 10 minutes later, we heard the front door slam. Confused, we both went downstairs to see if maybe one of our other friends had decided to stop by. Laura's house was a popular hangout spot, and her parents didn't mind people coming and going, so it wasn't unusual for someone to show up without warning. However, what we found when we reached the bottom of the stairs was something neither of us expected. Standing there, talking to Laura's mom, was Patrick. I felt my stomach drop. There was no reason for him to be there. Laura's mom, being the kind-hearted person she was, asked him what he was doing at the house. His reply? "I was summoned." I'll never forget the way he said it, with absolutely no emotion, like it was the most normal thing in the world. Laura's mom didn't seem to think much of it, probably because she knew Patrick and felt sorry for him. After a bit of small talk, she politely asked him to leave, which he did without any protest. He just turned around and walked out of the house as silently as he had come in. But Laura and I were horrified. As soon as he was gone, we rushed back upstairs, talking in frantic whispers about how weird that was. The more we thought about it, the more it seemed like he had appeared after we said his name 3 times. From that day on, we all made a pact. Never say Patrick's name 3 times in a conversation. It became an unspoken rule among our group. Things were quiet for a few months after that, and I started to convince myself that maybe I had overreacted. Maybe it was all just some strange coincidence. But that sense of normalcy didn't last long. One night, my friends and I were hanging out at Johnny's house. We were chilling on his back deck, talking about whatever came to mind. Once again, Patrick's name came up in conversation. Despite our warnings and attempts to convince him, Johnny refused to believe what we were telling him about Patrick. He thought it was all a joke, something we had made up to scare him. To prove his point, Johnny deliberately said Patrick's name 3 times, in a single sentence, no less. We all groaned and told him he was being reckless, but nothing happened at first. Johnny just grinned and told us we were idiots for believing in something so silly. For a moment, I almost believed him. But then, a few minutes later, Patrick jumped over Johnny's backyard fence. Johnny was the first to see him, and he stopped mid-sentence. The rest of us followed his gaze, and sure enough, there was Patrick, staring at us from the other side of the yard. None of us moved. None of us spoke. It was like the air had been sucked out of the atmosphere, and all we could do was wait for what Patrick might do next. After what felt like an eternity, Patrick jumped back over the fence and disappeared into the night. Johnny, visibly shaken, accused us of setting him up, insisting that we must have been working with Patrick to scare him. We swore up and down that we had nothing to do with it, but Johnny wasn't convinced. The rest of the night was tense, and Johnny eventually told us all to go home. I think that was the first time Johnny truly realized that Patrick wasn't just some quirky kid. There was something deeply unsettling about him. The last time I had an encounter with Patrick was the scariest and most disturbing of all. A few months after the incident at Johnny's house, I was home alone one night. It was a rare occasion since my parents were usually always around. I invited over a guy I had been talking to just to hang out. It was raining lightly outside, and we were in my room, making small talk. At one point, the guy made a joke about Patrick, which immediately made me uncomfortable. I tried to brush it off, but he noticed my reaction and asked why I looked so freaked out. I told him the whole story, expecting him to laugh it off. He did. He thought it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard, and to mess with me, he threatened to say Patrick's name 3 times. I begged him not to, but he just laughed and screamed Patrick's name at the top of his lungs 3 times in a row. This time there was no delay. The rain outside instantly picked up, and within seconds there was a flash of lightning. My heart started racing. The guy laughed, saying it was just a coincidence, but I wasn't so sure. I ran to my window to look outside, and when I glanced down at the driveway, I saw a figure standing in the rain, looking up at me. It was too dark to make out any features, but I was almost certain it was Patrick. Panicking, I shut the blinds and ran downstairs to make sure all the doors were locked. After securing the back door, I glanced out the window and saw the figure again, standing motionless in my front yard. I was terrified. I started screaming, "But I'm adopted!" over and over, hoping that somehow this would make him go away. The guy I was with came running downstairs and found me on the kitchen floor, in full panic mode. He tried to comfort me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Patrick was going to find a way inside. I looked out the window again, and to my relief, the figure was gone. The storm raged on, but Patrick had disappeared into the night. The next morning, after the guy had left, I went outside to check the yard. In the far corner of my backyard, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was Patrick's gray hoodie, the same one he always wore, and wrapped inside were a few of my belongings that I had thought were lost. I didn't call the police. I was too scared, and I figured I'd tell my parents when they got home the next day. But I never had to. Patrick didn't show up at school after that. In fact, none of us ever saw him again. He vanished, just as suddenly as he had appeared in our lives. To this day, no one knows what happened to him. My parents still live in the same house, and every time I visit, I can't help but wonder where Patrick is now. I know this isn't your typical scary story, but I've been looking for a place to share it. As I've gotten older, I've come to the conclusion that Patrick was likely a mentally disturbed stalker who followed me, and possibly other girls, around. That's probably how he always knew when his name was said. It's terrifying to think that he may have been lurking nearby, listening to me. I can only hope that wherever he is now, he's far, far away from me. The series of events I'm about to share happened over 30 years ago when I was a young child, around 10 years old. My memory might be a little foggy, but I'll try to recall the details as accurately as I can. At that time, my extended family was enormous. My dad was one of 9 children, and as a result, I had a ton of aunts, uncles, and cousins, many of whom I could barely remember. Family gatherings were always massive, and I'd often meet relatives who knew me, but whose faces I barely recognized. My grandparents on my dad's side were well off and owned a large beachfront property. It was a shared vacation home for my dad and all his siblings, and we'd often spend chunks of the summer there. The place was huge. I'm not sure of the exact size, but it could easily sleep over 30 people. My parents both had flexible jobs, so we were able to spend a lot of time at the beach house, along with my dad's siblings and their families. There were always cousins to play with, and the house was rarely empty. Among my large family, my favorite relative was my Uncle Joe. He was the father of my cousin Brandon, but while Brandon and I didn't spend much time together due to his quiet nature, I got along great with Uncle Joe. He had a way of brightening my mood, always making me laugh, and he was great with kids. Uncle Joe was also a licensed therapist and psychiatrist, so I confided in him a lot. He probably knew more about me than my own parents did, and I trusted him completely. That particular summer, however, I started experiencing some of the worst nightmares I'd ever had. They were vivid, disturbing, and varied in theme. Some nights, I dreamed of losing a family member. Other nights, I was consumed by feelings of loneliness and abandonment. These dreams terrified me, but there was one in particular I remember vividly. It was one of those false awakening dreams where I woke up in my bed and went downstairs, expecting to find my parents and siblings, only to realize the house was completely empty. Everyone had left without me, and I was alone. I woke up sobbing. After a few nights of these nightmares, I decided to tell Uncle Joe about them. I didn't want to tell my parents because I was embarrassed. Uncle Joe listened intently, taking notes in his little notebook as I described the details of my dreams. His face was serious, and when I finished, he told me that something was bothering my subconscious, and that I needed to do some self-reflection. He promised to think about it and asked me to come back to him if the nightmares continued. Of course they did. A few nights later, I went to Uncle Joe again, telling him that the nightmares hadn't stopped. He told me he had been thinking about it and had figured out what was going on. According to him, I was harboring deep-seated frustration and resentment toward my parents. I was confused. I was a well-behaved, respectful kid, and I loved my parents more than anything. The idea that I could be angry at them without realizing it felt wrong. But Uncle Joe was a therapist. He knew what he was talking about, so I believed him. He told me that it was normal for these feelings to be buried in my subconscious, and that even if I didn't consciously recognize them, they could manifest in my dreams. He encouraged me to express my frustration, suggesting I be a little more disobedient to see how it felt. He wanted me to argue with my parents, to say no more often. Reluctantly, I agreed to try. For 3 days, I acted completely out of character. I pushed back against my parents, said no to things I would normally agree to, and argued when I didn't get my way. My behavior concerned my parents, and they sat me down, telling me they didn't like the way I'd been acting. It pained me to disobey them, but I was desperate to stop the nightmares. Unfortunately, the nightmares only got worse. They became more graphic, more intense, and more terrifying. I was at my wit's end and went back to Uncle Joe for help. This time, he seemed hesitant. After some pleading, he finally told me that my mind was too mature for my young body, and that I needed to set it free. I had no idea what he meant, and his cryptic words scared me. He told me that if I had one more nightmare, he would explain everything. That night, I went to bed terrified, afraid of what he might ask me to do. But for the first time in weeks, I woke up before having a nightmare. I was relieved at first, but then a strange sense of fear crept over me. I wasn't paralyzed, but I was too afraid to move. I lay there in bed, staring at the wall, when I heard it, whispering, right next to my ear. It was Uncle Joe's voice. I was certain of it. I whipped around and screamed, catching sight of him standing next to my bed. He stumbled back and quickly fled the room, closing the door behind him. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I didn't know what to think. Was I still dreaming? Was this some kind of sick joke? Without hesitation, I ran to my parents' room and told them everything. About the nightmares, Uncle Joe's strange behavior, and what had just happened. My dad didn't waste any time. He stormed into Uncle Joe's room, demanding answers. Uncle Joe denied everything, but my dad wasn't buying it. In the commotion, my dad grabbed Uncle Joe's satchel, the one he always carried, and started rifling through it. What he found inside was horrifying. Uncle Joe had pages upon pages of notes about my nightmares, along with articles and documents about inducing dreams and nightmares. There were personal notes, diagrams, and data from what looked like some kind of twisted experiments. Uncle Joe had been using me for his own sick research. My dad threw Uncle Joe out of the house that night. The police were called, and when they searched his belongings and computer, they found even more disturbing things. I won't go into detail, but it was clear Uncle Joe had dark intentions. He was arrested, and I never saw him again. Even though it's been over 30 years, the events of that summer still haunt me. Sometimes I wonder how I didn't see the warning signs sooner. How could I have been so naive? But I was just a kid, and Uncle Joe had manipulated me. I try not to dwell on it too much, but it's hard not to think about what might have happened if I hadn't woken up that night. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed our stories and would like to hear more, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you captivating tales and new content every week. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We appreciate every one of you for being a part of our storytelling journey.